In the spring of 1518, a Spanish soldier found a man hiding in a goat pen on the outskirts of Tlemcen, in what is now northern Algeria. The man was wounded. He had one real arm and one arm made of silver, a prosthetic, custom-fitted, the kind of thing you commission when you intend to keep fighting. The Spanish soldier did not ask his name. He already knew it. He drew his sword and took the man's head. The dead man was Barbarossa, pirate, conqueror of Algiers, self-declared Sultan of the Western Mediterranean, a man who had lost his arm in battle, replaced it with silver, and gone back to sea. A man who had built a corsair state from nothing and watched it survive 3 Spanish counterattacks before the 4th one finally found him in a goat pen at the end of a dirt road. His younger brother Khizr was 40 miles away when it happened. He was not there when Oroch died. He did not see the body. He learned about it the way men in that century learned about everything that mattered, through someone who had survived, riding hard with bad news. What Khizr did next, no one expected. He did not mourn publicly. He did not retreat. He took his brother's name, his brother's fleet, and his brother's unfinished war, and he fought it to an end that Oroch never lived to see. History would remember him as Barbarossa, the man who turned a dead brother's name into the most feared title on the Mediterranean. The man who, with borrowed identity and inherited grief, built an empire that outlasted everyone who tried to stop him. To understand what Khizr was inheriting in 1518, you have to understand what the Mediterranean looked like at the beginning of the 16th century. It was not a sea. It was a war zone with water in it. On one side, the Spanish Empire, newly unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, freshly victorious after the Reconquista of 1492, flush with the silver of the Americas, and burning with a particular kind of religious certainty that made it extraordinarily dangerous. Spain had spent 7 centuries fighting to expel Islam from the Iberian Peninsula. That war had not ended with the fall of Granada. It had simply changed direction. The Spanish turned south, toward the coast of North Africa, where Muslim cities stood close enough to smell, and where the displaced Muslims of Andalusia had fled after 1492, carrying their grief and their memory of what had been taken from them. Between 1505 and 1511, Spain seized a string of North African ports: Oran, Béjaïa, Tripoli, fortified positions designed to control the coastline, suppress piracy, and extend the reach of the empire across the water. On the other side of the sea, the Ottoman Empire under Selim I and then Suleiman the Magnificent was in the middle of the most aggressive expansion in its history. Selim had defeated the Safavid Persians at Chaldiran in 1514. He had absorbed Syria and Egypt by 1517. His son, Suleiman, would take Belgrade in 1521, Rhodes in 1522, and stand at the gates of Vienna in 1529. Between these two forces, the Spanish pressing south and the Ottomans pressing west, the Mediterranean was full of smaller powers threading the needle between them. Venice, balancing Ottoman trade against Christian political alliances, losing ground in both directions. Genoa, selling its naval expertise to whoever paid most. The Knights Hospitaller, conducting something between a holy war and a piracy operation against Muslim shipping, sanctified by crusading ideology that was already 2 centuries past its moment. And then there were the corsairs. The word comes from the Latin cursus, a raid, a fast, violent pass through someone else's waters. They operated in a legal grey space the 16th century had invented specifically for people like them. The English maritime historian Hamilton Curry, writing in his 1910 study, Sea Wolves of the Mediterranean, described the corsair culture of this period as a permanent condition, rather than a criminal aberration, the logical result of a sea where no single power held enough authority to enforce peace. The line between a corsair and an admiral, he argued, was simply a matter of whose fleet you ended up commanding. Khizr would prove that argument more completely than anyone else in the century. But the proof required one more death first. The island of Lesbos sits in the northeastern Aegean Sea, close enough to the Anatolian coast that on a clear day you can see the mountains of Turkey from its eastern shore. In 1462, it became Ottoman by military conquest. Among the soldiers who participated was a cavalry officer named Yakup Aga, who was granted a small fief on the island as a reward for his service. Yakup was a practical man. He retired from soldiering, took up pottery, and bought a boat to carry his goods between the Aegean ports. He married a local woman named Katerina, Greek Orthodox, the widow of a priest, from a world entirely different from his own. They had 6 children, 4 sons, Ishak, Oruç, Khizr, and Ilyas. 2 daughters, whose names the historical record did not think worth preserving. The family lived at the intersection of 2 civilizations. Their father was a Muslim soldier of Turkish origin. Their mother was a Greek Christian widow. They grew up on an island that had been Genoese, then Ottoman, where the language of the street mixed Greek and Turkish, and the religion of the household depended on which parent you were talking to. All 4 brothers went to sea. They learned the Aegean the way you can only learn it as a child. The seasonal winds, the treacherous channels, the harbors that turned dangerous in the afternoon. Khizr was the 3rd son. He helped with the pottery while his older brothers sailed first. He was not the one people noticed. That changed the day the Knights of Rhodes noticed the family instead. The Knights Hospitaller had been raiding Ottoman and Muslim shipping in the Aegean for years. They targeted anyone who could not fight back effectively. The youngest brother, Ilyas, was killed. Oruç, the eldest, was captured and taken to the Knights' castle at Bodrum on the Anatolian coast, where he was held for nearly 3 years. 3 years is a long time to be a prisoner, long enough to understand what you are to the people holding you. A commodity, a bargaining piece, a man who exists only in relation to what he might be traded for. Oruç came out of Bodrum understanding something about the world that he had not understood when he went in. The Gazavat-i Hayreddin Pasha, the 5-volume memoir that Barbarossa would later dictate to his officer Murad Sinan Reis, preserved today at Topkapi Palace and the Istanbul University Library, is not detailed about how Khizr organized the escape from Bodrum. What it records is that he did. The younger brother, the one who had been making pottery while Oruç sailed, got his brother out of a crusader prison. Not for strategy, not for fleet strength, for the simple, unglamorous reason that Oruç was in there and Khizr was not, and that was wrong. After that, the brothers did not go back to trading. They had learned something about what happened to men who stayed quiet and carried pottery. By 1503, Oruç was operating out of the island of Djerba off the Tunisian coast. Khizr joined him. From 1504 to 1510, alongside the raiding, Oruç transported Muslim refugees, the Moriscos of Andalusia, expelled after the fall of Granada, stranded in a hostile Spain. He carried them across the water to North Africa, thousands of them, families with children, old men with nothing left. For this, the people of North Africa gave him a name, Baba Oruç, Father Oruç. The Europeans, hearing the Arabic, turned it into something they could pronounce. Baba Oruç became Barbarossa, Redbeard in Italian. In 1512, during an assault on Béjaïa, Oruç lost his left arm to a Spanish arquebus shot. He commissioned a silver prosthetic and returned to sea. His men called him Gumus Kol, Silver Arm. By 1516, the brothers had captured Algiers from Spain, and Oruç had declared himself Sultan. In 1518, the Spanish came back with an army too large to refuse. Oruç fled. They found him in a goat pen outside Tlemcen. Khizr was 40 miles away. He was now the last of the brothers, alone with a fleet, a city, and a dead man's name. The weeks after Oruç's death were the most dangerous of Khizr's life, and they contained the decision that made everything else possible. The Spanish army under Diego de Córdoba was in the field with 10,000 soldiers. Tlemcen had fallen. Algiers was exposed. Khizr had a fleet that was formidable for a corsair operation, but wholly inadequate to hold a coastline against an imperial army backed by the treasury of the Americas. He had no political standing beyond what his dead brother had left him, which, in the absence of Oruç's personal authority, was worth considerably less than it had been the week before. He could have sailed away. Plenty of men in his position had made exactly that calculation. Instead, he sent a message to Constantinople. The offer, as recorded in the Gazavat-i Hayreddin Pasha, was simple and audacious simultaneously. He would give Algiers to the Ottoman Empire, the city, the harbor, the corsair network, the strategic position on the western Mediterranean coast that no Ottoman fleet had yet been able to reach through its own power. In exchange, he wanted soldiers, ships, and the political weight that came with flying the Sultan's flag. Sultan Selim I accepted. The logic was clean on both sides. For Selim, Algiers was a gift that could not have been purchased. A fortified harbor on the African coast, staffed by experienced corsairs who knew every current of the Western Mediterranean, commanded by a man who had just demonstrated he could hold it against Spain. For Khizr, the Ottoman Empire was the only patron large enough to make the city defensible. Without Ottoman janissaries and galleys, Algiers would fall within a season. With them, it became something Spain could not simply march over. What he gave up was real, and he knew it. Oruç had been sultan, sovereign, answerable to no one. Khizr became Beylerbey, governor of governors, a title with enormous practical authority, but conferred by a higher power that could, in theory, be revoked. Some historians read this as submission. The more careful reading recognizes it as something harder to find and harder to execute. The ability to accurately assess your own position, identify what you cannot change, and trade what you cannot keep for what you actually need. Selim gave him rank, janissaries, galleys, and artillery. He also gave him a name, Hayreddin, from the Arabic Khair ad-Din, goodness of the faith. In the Ottoman court, a name given by the Sultan was a public statement. Selim was not simply thanking a useful vassal. He was defining him, announcing what this man was and what he was expected to become. He was now, depending on who was counting and in what language, 3 different people. He had been born Khizr, the third son of a potter on Lesbos. He had become Barbarossa by inheritance, the morning a Spanish sword took his brother's head. He had been named Hayreddin by the Sultan of the most powerful empire in the world. 3 names, 3 lives, 3 versions of the same man layered on top of each other, and the most dangerous version had not yet fully arrived. Between 1519 and 1533, Hayreddin Barbarossa built something that had no precedent in the Mediterranean world. Not a pirate fleet, not exactly a navy, something in between. A corsair state with genuine military depth, diplomatic sophistication, and a reach extending from the Strait of Gibraltar to the Calabrian coast of Italy. He reinforced Algiers harbor, rebuilt its fortifications, and expanded its fleet beyond the corsair operation Oruç had run into something approaching a standing naval force. He recruited experienced captains from across the Mediterranean, men with their own grievances against Spain or Venice or the Knights of Malta, men who had sailed these waters long enough to know where the rocks were and where the currents ran in October. By the mid-1520s, Algiers was the most formidable corsair port in the Western Mediterranean. He raided the Italian coast with a regularity that became its own kind of pressure. Calabria, the islands of Capri and Procida, the coast of Liguria, every coastal governor from Naples to Barcelona who had to maintain a garrison, post lookouts, and keep ships in harbor for defense rather than trade, was a governor spending money that could not be recovered. Barbarossa was expensive for his own side. He was more expensive for the side trying to stop him. In 1529, he removed the thorn that had been in Algiers' side for 19 years. The Penon d'Algiers was a small, rocky island at the mouth of the harbor, held by Spain since 1510, fortified as a chokehold on the city's access to the sea. He bombarded it with Ottoman-supplied heavy artillery for 14 days. When the garrison surrendered, he demolished the fortifications and built a causeway connecting the former island to the mainland, permanently altering the geography of the harbor, signaling to every power watching that the city was no longer accessible to coercion. In December 1533, he arrived in Constantinople. He came with a procession, hundreds of prisoners, bags of silver and gold, exotic animals, and the captains of a fleet that had made itself feared from Gibraltar to the Aegean. The streets of Constantinople were watched. He was described by witnesses as a large man, dark-bearded, with the physical stillness that very dangerous men sometimes possess. Not aggressive, not theatrical, simply very much present in a way that made the space around him feel smaller. The audience with Suleiman, recorded in the imperial chronicles of the Suleymannameh, broke protocol in a way the court specifically noted. Guests of the Sultan stood. Barbarossa was permitted to sit. The gesture was deliberate. Suleiman was not receiving a supplicant. He was receiving a man whose capabilities were so evident that ordinary hierarchy needed to accommodate him. He was appointed Capudan Iberia, Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet. He was given authority over every Ottoman naval operation in the Mediterranean, the resources of the empire's shipyards, and the governance of the provinces of Rhodes, Euboea, and Chios in the Aegean. Suleiman also bestowed the name Hayreddin formally and publicly. 3 names, each one a different life, each one earned at a different cost. In 1534, he sailed from Constantinople with 80 galleys, the largest Ottoman force the Western Mediterranean had ever faced. By July of that year, Tunis was his. He was the most powerful naval commander in the world, not by reputation or legacy, by the simple calculation of ships, men, and what he had proven he could do with them. The Venetian chronicler Pietro Aretino described what it felt like on the Italian coast when Barbarossa's fleet appeared on the horizon. He did not describe it as a military event. He described it as a fact of nature, something that happened, like weather, that you could neither prevent nor argue with. You could only watch it come and calculate whether it was coming for you. In the autumn of 1538, all of Catholic Europe assembled in one place to prove that the feeling was wrong. In February 1538, Pope Paul III assembled a Holy League. The list of participants tells you how seriously Europe was taking the threat. The Papal States, the Habsburg Empire of Charles V, Spain, Naples, Sicily, and the military machine funded by American silver. Venice, Genoa, whose Admiral Andrea Doria was considered the finest naval commander in Christian Europe. The Knights of Malta, all of them together, against one man. The fleet they assembled at Corfu was the largest Christian naval force in a generation. Approximately 302 ships, including 162 galleys and 140 sailing vessels, with somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 men aboard, 2,500 guns. The combined naval might of Catholic Europe, organized, funded, and pointed at a single target. Barbarossa had 122 galleys and galleots. His ships were lighter, faster, and crewed by men who had spent their careers in these waters. On paper, the Holy League outnumbered him in hulls, in guns, in men, and in tonnage. Andrea Doria looked at the intelligence reports and saw an engagement he could not lose by any rational calculation. This is the part where rational calculation failed him. Barbarossa arrived at Preveza, a small Ottoman port on the western coast of Greece, at the mouth of the Gulf of Arta, in late September 1538. The geography of the Gulf was the first decision, and it was the right one. The Gulf of Arta is a near-enclosed body of water with a narrow mouth. Whoever controlled the entrance controlled everything inside. His lieutenant, Sinan Reis, suggested landing troops at Actium, the same stretch of water where, in 31 BC, Octavian had destroyed Mark Antony's fleet. The geography that had decided one empire was about to help decide another. With Ottoman forces holding Actium and controlling the artillery at the Gulf's mouth, Doria faced a problem he could not solve cleanly. If he sent his fleet into the Gulf, Ottoman shore guns would fire into his flanks. If he kept his fleet outside and tried to engage at the entrance, he had to navigate a bottleneck under artillery fire. If the wind shifted, and the Ionian winds in September are not reliable, his larger, heavier sailing vessels could be driven onto the Ottoman-controlled shore. For 3 days, the two fleets watched each other. The Holy League made 2 attempts to land forces and neutralize the Ottoman shore artillery. Both were repulsed by Murat Reis on September 25th and 26th. On the night of September 27th, Doria moved his fleet south toward the island of Lefkada, hoping to draw Barbarossa into open water where Christian gunnery advantages could tell. At dawn on September 28th, Doria was surprised. Barbarossa had moved his fleet out during the night. At first light, he was already heading south, with Turgut Reis leading the vanguard with his fastest ships. The man who had expected to do the approaching found himself being approached. What followed was not the decisive fleet engagement the Holy League had assembled to fight. Barbarossa's galleots were faster and more maneuverable than the heavy Venetian and Spanish galleons. They harassed the flanks, drew fire, withdrew, and returned at different angles. The great Venetian flagship was becalmed miles from the action, surrounded by Ottoman galleys, while the wind kept the rest of the Christian fleet from reaching her. When the wind finally rose, Doria executed a maneuver the Venetian commanders interpreted as abandonment. He turned away, claiming Barbarossa was too close to the Ottoman-controlled shore to engage safely. The Christian fleet withdrew. The following morning, Doria ordered all League vessels to disengage. Barbarossa had not destroyed the Holy League fleet. He had not needed to. He had used the geography, the wind, the shore artillery, and the structural distrust between Venice and Genoa to neutralize a force that outnumbered him by more than 2 to 1, without committing to the kind of pitched engagement where numbers would have mattered. The court inquiry that followed produced mutually incompatible conclusions. Venetian sources blamed Doria for inaction. Spanish and Genoese sources blamed Venice for refusing to follow Doria's battle plan. Both versions agree on the outcome. The largest Christian naval force assembled in a generation had turned away from 122 galleys without fighting. Barbarossa lost no ships. Venice signed a peace treaty in October 1540, recognizing Ottoman territorial gains and paying 300,000 gold ducats in compensation. On the night before the battle, while the Holy League was repositioning and the Ottoman fleet was preparing to move, Barbarossa's men could see the Christian lanterns on the water. He knew exactly where Doria was. He knew the League outnumbered him. He had been fighting against odds his entire life, since the Knights of Rhodes killed his brother and imprisoned the other one, since Tlemcen fell and he was alone with a fleet and a dead man's name. The odds at Preveza were better than some of the odds he had survived. He ordered his captains to move before dawn, not because the mathematics favored him, because the mathematics had never favored him, and he had learned, over 4 decades at sea, that the man who moves first controls what the mathematics mean. The victory at Preveza secured Ottoman dominance over the Mediterranean for the next 33 years, until the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, a quarter century after Barbarossa's own death. One battle, one morning in September, the whole arc of Mediterranean power bent by one decision made in the dark before the sun rose. Tunis should have held. When Barbarossa took the city in 1534, it controlled the passage between the eastern and western Mediterranean. It had a protected harbor. It was, strategically, irreplaceable. In the summer of 1535, Charles V took it back. The Holy Roman Emperor led the campaign personally, 400 ships and 30,000 soldiers. Barbarossa held the harbor fortress of La Goulette longer than anyone expected. When it fell, the city followed. He evacuated what he could, retreated to Algeria, and watched from the sea as Charles V entered Tunis in triumph. It was the first major reversal of his career. He had been fighting continuously for 30 years. And he knew, with the clarity of long experience, that what he had lost was not simply a city. He had lost the argument that Ottoman power in the Western Mediterranean was irreversible. What he did next reveals something about the kind of man he was beneath the admiralty and the titles. In 1535, he approached the harbor of Mahon on Minorca, flying Spanish flags. The garrison, seeing what appeared to be a friendly fleet, opened the harbor without resistance. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it was too late. He took the city, took the surrounding settlements, took approximately 6,000 people captive, and sailed away before any relief force could respond. The raid was not a strategic restoration of what he had lost at Tunis. It was a demonstration that Spain's victory had not made him harmless. There is another incident from these years that the historical sources record without quite knowing what to do with it. In 1544, during a campaign along the Italian coast conducted in alliance with France, Barbarossa's fleet appeared before the Tuscan coast. Among the things he destroyed was a tomb. The tomb of a man named Bartolomeo Peretti, who had burned down the house where Jakub Aga, Barbarossa's father, had lived on Lesbos the previous year. Peretti had been dead for less than a year. Barbarossa was in his 60s. He was Grand Admiral of the Ottoman Empire, conducting a joint campaign with the King of France. He stopped a military operation to burn the grave of the man who had burned his father's house. There is no strategic explanation for this, only the explanation that underneath the Admiral and all three of his names, there was still a boy from Lesbos who had loaded pottery onto a boat with his father, and that boy had a very long memory and had not yet finished settling accounts. In 1545, Hayreddin Barbarossa retired. He did not do so because he was forced to. He was not defeated, not politically outmaneuvered, not stripped of his command. He left his position in Algiers to his son Hassan Pasha and sailed back to Constantinople for the last time. He settled in a palace in the Buyukdere neighborhood on the northwestern shores of the Bosphorus. Gardens running down to the water, the sound of shipping passing in the strait, the constant traffic of a city that was the center of the world's most powerful empire. He spent his final year dictating. The Ghazavat-i Hayreddin Pasha, the conquests of Hayreddin Pasha, was not written by Barbarossa. It was spoken by him to an officer named Murad Sinan Reis, who transcribed what he said into 5 handwritten volumes that still exist today, preserved at Topkapi Palace and the Istanbul University Library. This is the closest we get to his own voice. Not the chronicles of his enemies, who called him a pirate and a scourge. Not the official Ottoman records, which described him in the language of imperial service. His own account, dictated in his own words to a man who had sailed with him in the last year of his life. He describes campaigns, strategy, the political calculations behind decisions that looked, from the outside, like pure violence. He was not writing a confession. He was writing a logbook, the logbook of a captain who understood that the sea does not care what you felt, only what you did and whether it worked. He also arranged for something that tells you more about him than anything in the Ghazavat. He bequeathed a sum of money to ensure that a candle would be lit in his tomb every single night. Not occasionally, not on feast days, every night. He wanted the light to continue after he was gone. A man who does this is not a man who expects to be forgotten. He is a man who knows he will be remembered and is making arrangements accordingly. On the 4th of July, 1546, Hayreddin Barbarossa died in his palace in Buyukdere. He died in a bed, with walls around him and a roof above him, and the sound of the Bosphorus outside. He died the way almost no pirate, corsair, or admiral of his century died, of age, in peace, in his own house. His mausoleum in the Beşiktaş district of Constantinople was designed and built by Mimar Sinan, the greatest architect of the Ottoman Empire, the man who built the Süleymaniye Mosque. Sinan had completed the mausoleum in 1541, 5 years before Barbarossa's death, at the site on the Bosphorus shore where his fleet had always assembled before sailing. The mausoleum was ready and waiting for him. He had probably stood in it. He was that kind of man, the kind who arranges his own endings. The Ottoman fleet that left Constantinople for any major campaign in the decades after 1546 followed the same route out of the Golden Horn shipyard, down the Bosphorus, and into the Sea of Marmara. Before it cleared the strait, it stopped at Beşiktaş. The captains and officers went ashore. They visited the mausoleum. They offered prayers. Then the fleet fired its guns in the direction of the tomb. The ceremony, called Çimavira, formal naval protocol, as binding on an Ottoman admiral as any order from the Sultan. The tradition lasted until the Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century, when the empire, in the middle of its long, painful modernization, began setting aside the older ceremonial structures. According to Ottoman naval tradition, the consequences were felt almost immediately. In 1565, the Ottoman fleet besieged Malta, the island fortress of the successors of the very Knights Hospitaller who had killed Ilyas and imprisoned Oruç 60 years before. The siege failed. The stories that circulated afterward included the detail that the commanders had been in too much of a hurry to make the customary stop at Beşiktaş before sailing. Whether this was the reason the siege failed, or simply what people needed to believe, the historical record does not adjudicate. Barbarossa died in 1546. The corsair state of Algiers that he had built from Oruç's remains and Ottoman support continued as a functioning political entity until the French conquest of Algeria in 1830. 284 years after his death, the institution he had created was still operating from the harbor he had fortified. The Barbary corsairs who sailed from that harbor in the centuries after were not his men. They were the inheritors of a structure he had built, operating under conventions and from bases that would not have existed without the decisions he had made between 1518 and 1533. In 2019, the Turkish Navy formally revived the Çimavira tradition, conducting the first official salute at his tomb in more than a century. Reported by the Daily Sabah, an admiral stood at the mausoleum in Beşiktaş while naval vessels fired their guns in the strait outside. 500 years after the boy from Lesbos had first put out to sea in his father's trading boat, the navy he had built was still stopping to say his name before going to war. The 5 volumes of the Gazavat-i Hayreddin Pasha are still there, in the Topkapi Palace collections and at Istanbul University Library. Scholars have been studying them for centuries. The man who dictated them, who sat in his palace above the Bosphorus in the last year of his life and spoke what he remembered into the ear of an officer with a pen, would not have been surprised that they survived. He was building for survival. He always was. Whether one version of this man is the real one depends entirely, as the Venetian sources understood and wrote down, on which shore you were standing on when his fleet appeared on the horizon. To the Ottomans, a hero of Islam and the sea. To the Spanish and Italian coasts, a name mothers used to frighten children for 200 years. To the refugees of Andalusia, the man who carried them across the water when no one else would. To his brother's memory, the man who picked up what Oruç had been forced to put down. He was born Khizr, the 3rd son of a potter on a small Aegean island. He helped fire clay pots and load them onto a boat and carry them between harbors that the Aegean wind made difficult in autumn. He was not the first son, not the remarkable one, not the one history was waiting for. He became Barbarossa because his brother died in a goat pen and the name needed someone to carry it. He did not choose the name. The name chose him the way inheritance always chooses, not by what you deserve, but by what you are willing to do with what is left. He became Hayreddin because a sultan looked at what he had built and decided it deserved a name that meant something in the language of faith. 3 names, 3 different men inside the same life. The potter's son, the dead brother's heir, the sultan's admiral. Each one true, none of them complete. The people who change things are rarely the people who were supposed to. They are the 3rd son, the younger brother, the man who was making pottery while the remarkable one went to sea. They are the ones left behind when the first wave breaks, the ones who have to decide, in the wreckage, whether to rebuild or walk away. Khizr could have walked away in 1518. The Mediterranean was large. There were other harbors. No one would have remembered the name he chose not to carry. He did not walk away, and the world he refused to leave alone became, in some measure, the world that we inherited. With its coastlines reshaped, its naval traditions still stopping at a tomb in Istanbul before going to war. Its history bent by one decision made by a man who had no particular reason to stay, and stayed anyway. He spent his last year speaking his memories into the ear of an officer with a pen, so that what happened would not be lost. He arranged for a candle to burn in his tomb every night. The candle has been burning, on and off, for nearly 500 years. Some names, once taken up, cannot be put down. They find the person willing to carry them, and they do not let go until the carrying is done. And by then, the person and the name have become the same thing. And it is no longer possible to say which one was real. He was somebody's younger brother. He had a name nobody chose for him. He kept it anyway, and the sea still makes the sound of it.